Every morning, long before the financial markets begin to move, something quiet happens. Before traders open their screens filled with charts, before investors make decisions that can move billions of dollars across continents, before headlines begin to shape the mood of the global economy, a single number appears. Sometimes it's the inflation rate, sometimes it's the unemployment figure, sometimes it's a new estimate of economic growth. For most people, it seems like just another statistic mentioned briefly on the news, a small update in the endless flow of economic reports. But in reality, that single number can move the world. Markets may surge within seconds, trillions of dollars can shift direction, central banks may rethink their entire strategy, and investors everywhere begin asking the same question: what does this number mean? Yet there is another question that almost nobody asks. Where did that number come from? Because in the modern economic system, numbers are not simply discovered, like gold buried in the ground. They are built, constructed, calculated, and sometimes interpreted. Behind every economic statistic lies a complex process that begins long before the data appears on television screens or financial news feeds. In the United States, many of the most important economic indicators come from government institutions. One of them is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This agency publishes the famous unemployment rate and many key inflation indicators. Another is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which calculates the gross domestic product, the number used to measure the total output of the American economy. In Europe, a similar role is played by Eurostat. In the United Kingdom, it is the Office for National Statistics. Inside these institutions, thousands of economists, statisticians, and researchers work quietly every day. They collect enormous amounts of information: prices from supermarkets, wages from companies, household spending, manufacturing data, transportation costs, energy prices. Millions of individual data points are gathered from across entire economies. At first glance, the process appears extremely scientific, even mechanical. But hidden inside this scientific process is something unavoidable: human decisions. Because economic numbers are not objects that exist naturally in the world. They're built through statistical models, definitions, and assumptions. Take inflation, for example. When statisticians try to measure inflation, they must first define something called the consumer basket. This basket represents the typical goods and services purchased by households: food, housing, transportation, energy, healthcare, technology, education. Each category receives a certain weight. But here is the critical question: which products should be included, and how much weight should each product receive? If those weights change slightly, the final inflation number can change as well. This issue became the center of one of the most famous debates in economic statistics during the 1990s. The United States government created a commission to study whether inflation was being measured accurately. The commission was led by economist Michael Boskin. Its findings became known as the Boskin Commission Report. The report suggested that the traditional method of measuring inflation might actually overestimate how much prices were rising. The commission recommended several adjustments. One of them was the substitution effect. The idea is simple. When the price of one product rises, consumers may switch to a cheaper alternative. Another adjustment involved something called quality improvements. For example, modern computers are far more powerful than those from decades ago. So even if prices remain the same, the value received by consumers may have increased. These changes might sound technical, but their impact was significant.
After the adjustments were introduced, the official inflation rate often appeared slightly lower than it would have been under the old system. This was not necessarily manipulation, it was a reminder of something important. How we measure something can change the result. The same principle applies to unemployment. When you hear on the news that unemployment is 5%, the number seems simple and precise, but the reality is more complicated. According to the definition used by the International Labor Organization, a person is considered unemployed only if three conditions are met. They must not have worked during the reference period. They must have actively searched for work recently, and they must be available to start working. This definition excludes millions of people from the official unemployment rate. Someone who stopped looking for work because they lost hope is not counted. Someone working only a few hours a week while wanting a full-time job may not appear clearly in the main statistics. For this reason, the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes several different unemployment measures. The most famous one is called U3. This is the number usually reported in the news. But there is also a broader measure known as U6. This indicator includes part-time workers who want full-time jobs and other categories of underemployment, and it is often significantly higher than the headline unemployment rate. But once these numbers are released, another crucial process begins: interpretation. Because numbers alone rarely tell the full story. This is where major financial institutions enter the scene. Global investment banks like Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Morgan Stanley employ large teams of economists and analysts. Their job is not just to read the data, their job is to interpret it, to translate numbers into predictions about the future. Some of these economists are followed closely by financial markets, people like Jan Hatzius, whose forecasts about the U.S. economy often influence investor expectations, or David Kelly, who frequently appears in financial media analyzing global economic trends. When a major economic report is released, these institutions respond almost immediately. Within minutes or hours, detailed analysis is published. Investors across the world read these reports carefully because sometimes the interpretation of data matters even more than the data itself. The same number can tell completely different stories depending on the context. Rising inflation could signal danger, or it could signal strong demand and economic growth. Low unemployment could mean a strong labor market, but it could also indicate inflationary pressure if the labor supply becomes too tight. In this way, economic numbers become a language spoken by the global financial system. But investment banks are not the only institutions shaping economic perceptions. Another powerful group operates quietly behind the scenes: credit rating agencies. Only 3 companies dominate this industry: Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch Ratings. Their role is to evaluate the ability of governments and corporations to repay their debts. They assign ratings such as AAA, AA, or BBB. At first glance, these ratings appear to be technical opinions, but their consequences can be enormous. When a country's credit rating is downgraded, the cost of borrowing can rise almost instantly. Investors may demand higher interest rates to hold that country's bonds. In extreme cases, this can place serious pressure on national finances. These agencies faced intense criticism after the event now known as the global financial crisis. Before that crisis, many mortgage-related financial products in the United States were given very high credit ratings. When the housing market collapsed and mortgage defaults surged, it became clear that many of those ratings had underestimated the risks. The crisis revealed something fundamental about the modern financial system. It runs on trust. Trust in numbers. Trust in ratings. Trust in data. When investors trust economic data, markets function smoothly.
When people trust their national currency, the financial system remains stable. And when governments trust economic indicators, they use them to guide policy decisions. One of the institutions that relies heavily on these numbers is the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. When policymakers at the Fed meet to decide interest rates, they examine a vast range of indicators: inflation, employment, economic growth, industrial production, consumer confidence. A single decision made inside this institution can influence not only the American economy, but the entire world. That is why markets watch every economic report so closely. But in recent years, some economists have begun to question whether traditional indicators capture the full picture of economic reality. One of them is Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. He has argued that societies should develop new ways to measure economic progress and social well-being. Another influential voice is French economist Thomas Piketty. His research on inequality showed that strong economic growth can coexist with extreme concentration of wealth. In other words, a growing economy does not necessarily mean prosperity for everyone. These debates have inspired new ideas, alternative measures of progress, quality of life indicators, inequality metrics.
Even national happiness indexes used by some countries to complement traditional economic statistics, because the real economy, the one people experience in their daily lives, is far more complex than a few numbers in a government report. And yet, those numbers still matter enormously. A single statistic released in the morning can move markets by the afternoon. It can influence central bank decisions. It can shape the future of businesses, governments, and millions of ordinary people who may never even hear about it. So the next time you hear that inflation has fallen, or that unemployment has improved, or that the economy is growing, remember something important. That number did not appear out of nowhere. It passed through a long chain of data collection, statistical models, methodological decisions, and expert interpretation. Economic numbers are not lies, but they are not perfect mirrors of reality either. They are tools, attempts to understand an incredibly complex system using mathematics and statistics. And if you want to explore the deeper stories behind money, power, and the hidden forces that shape the global economy, make sure to subscribe to the History of Money channel and turn on notifications, because on this channel we go beyond the headlines to uncover the real history of money, finance, and the economic forces shaping our world.